And today is the purchase agreement. A very, very necessary class. A very dry class. I'm not exciting like Dean and Larry and all those guys. I just get up to give you the boring details that you need to know, okay? The first thing I'm going to say, I'm going to do my best to keep it to an hour. It is really hard to do this in an hour, but I know we've all got things to do. So I may not cover everything on here. As a general introduction, raise your hand if you've never filled out one of the Richmond purchase agreement contracts. Raise them high. Oh. I thought, okay. Oh, Wade, you have sold something, haven't you?
No, yeah. It's pending, but almost.
Okay. All right. So let me preface this by saying everything I'm teaching is off of the Richmond contract. So I may say, this is covered by the seller, or this is whatever. You need to be aware if you're doing business in the outskirts and you get a Northern Virginia contract, maybe I'm not super familiar with the ones from Williamsburg, Virginia Beach. I'm not sure what they use, but they could be different. Grab you some forms there, Connor. So just because I say this is the way something happens, that means that's the way this contract is written, okay? So keep that in mind. If you've worked with builders, you've seen different contracts. So the number one thing, especially for you new agents, you need to read every document you are putting in front of your client. You need to read it, you need to understand it. You need to practice filling it out. Do not make the first time you fill out a purchase agreement for a client with a deadline of 6 p.m. on Friday be the first time you've ever touched a contract, okay? Your managers, your team leaders, other people in the office, they are all willing to help you. Pick a listing, write a contract, see which things mess you up, you're not sure about, go get your questions answered. Do that, and it's not a one-shot deal, guys. You may be here for 6 months before you actually get to present a contract, right? So that means I'd do it every week, or certainly every month. I'd make sure I stayed sharp on this, okay? The 2-page handout I gave you, I don't have time to go over all the different forms, but it tells you at the top, if you are using Transaction Desk, Instanet, whatever they call it these days, you can go in through to start a new transaction, access a template package, and we have all the forms there for a listing or for a purchase grouped together. You may not need all of them, but they're all there. So that's the way you can select them. I've given you some little notes here. This checklist should be your friend until you're an expert at doing this stuff. And I would say when you get old like me, you still need the checklist because you can't remember if you've included everything or not. But I've told you which forms are always required if you're writing a purchase agreement, which ones may only apply in a certain situation. So get familiar with all of those forms. Now the second page, you all need to go buy a little treat from Mr. Blakely Smith. He created this for our team several years ago. He hasn't updated it for the most recent change with the commission, but that's just a one-line item. This is a checklist for all the different blanks in your purchase agreement. So you're out showing the property, you're talking with the client, and they're saying, yeah, this is the one. If you're like me, you start mentally going down, okay, I need to know lender, I need to know price, I need to know home inspection. I can guarantee you're going to get back to your computer and you're going to have forgotten 1, 2, 3, or 4 of those things. So if you don't want to be sending off text after text after text, what'd you say you wanted on this? Do you want the refrigerator? Use this checklist. I would just print off a bunch, keep it handy, save it on your computer, and when you go to fill out a contract, if you have all these pieces of information, you've got pretty much everything you need to write the contract, other than any special terms or situations that might come up, okay? So I would keep that handy and thank Mr. Smith for creating that for us. All right, purchase agreement. I'm going to restate what I already said. Read it, read it, read it. Make sure your clients read it. The very first thing at the top that no one pays attention to, it's legally binding. This is a real world thing. So your buyers need to understand that. If they put one of these together, they are saying they want to buy the house they're putting an offer in on. You may come across a client that has a gazillion questions about the legal wording. If it gets over your head, never try to just make up an answer. Either come back and get an answer from someone else, or if they're really digging into the contract, say, you know, I can refer you to an attorney and he can go through it with you, all right? You need to remember you're not an attorney, you're not a CPA. Don't go in there saying, oh yeah, the tax implications of this or whatever. You're not a CPA, okay? So keep all that in mind. But your job is to explain this, and the goal of this class today is to give you kind of a general understanding of each paragraph so that when you're sitting down with your client, you can say, well, this is what this means, this is what this means, rather than reading it to them word for word. Another good tip, when you start showing homes to folks, give them a blank one. These aren't secret documents. Give them a blank one, let them start reading it, see what questions they have. So that none of you are looking at it for the first time when you're making that offer. Now, I am a huge fan of using electronic signing and sending things by email. That is great, but that does not alleviate your responsibility to explain this document. So you can set it all up, you know, using Instinet, send it over by AuthentiSign, but then you're on the phone at the other end. Okay, let's start at the top, and you work through it, and you make sure you've explained it to your client. I can't tell you how many times we hear clients say, well, I didn't know that. Nobody told me that. Well, we want to say, you should have read it. Well, you should have read it, Mr. Agent, and you should have explained it as well. Hey, come on in. Grab some forms there. All right, I'm going to zip through some of the kind of obvious things. Like I said, the notes in red are just little hints for you to remember. I'm sorry a couple things got cut off. Page 1, make sure you have all the owners when you're, you know, talk to the listing agent. Sometimes there's 3, 4, 5 owners on something. Make sure you've gotten all the right information. For the property itself, the real property, clearly identify it. Tax parcel number, street address. Remember I said at the beginning, you can access all this as a package. You can autofill some of that. You can either give it the tax number or the MLS number and it'll autofill. Still check it. Listing agents make errors putting things in there, so just check it before you move forward, but make sure the property is clearly identified. All right, personal property. That's anything that's not real property, anything that's not attached to the house. This paragraph lists a bunch of things. I'm going to tell you I cannot remember all the things that are listed. When we get into any contract issue, when an agent calls and says, hey, we got a problem, the very first thing I have to do is look to the paragraph that we're dealing with and read it word for word and see how it applies to our situation. That's just the way it is. It's a legal document. You have to interpret it given your circumstances. But for personal property, if it's attached, it's going to convey. But if there's ever a question, one of the big things is people see a TV on the wall. They think the TV's conveying, a buyer might. No, the mount is attached to the wall. The TV is attached to the mount. So just make sure you're clear. Don't ever just have a conversation with the listing agent where they say, oh yeah, they're leaving that. If it's important to your buyer, it needs to be in writing, all right? You can put it in here in the contract, and if you do, please add the phrase at no added value. That helps your lender out with appraisal. Best practice is really just use a bill of sale. That's another document in your package. And if you want curtains and refrigerator and blah, 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 list all that on the bill of sale. Paragraph 3 are the different addenda that you may have to attach. So if any of these apply, you would just mark the box. You fill out the purchase price, both in words and numbers. The next paragraph is all about the financing. The first section is if it's cash. It says it's not subject to lender financing. That means they're going to pay cash at settlement. That means it's their cash, it's not Uncle Joe's cash, and you need to verify those proof of funds. A lot of times, and you've got to ask some questions and you've got to get some documentation. Your client may not think they're telling you wrong, but they may not understand. We've had people say, oh yeah, I got cash, and then the deeper you dig, or when you get that proof of funds, you see it's some other family member. That doesn't count, because that family member, something could change between the time you close. It has to be this person's funds. For the financing, if they're getting a loan, one of the more recent changes, I feel like we've changed this contract so much in the last 2 or 3 years, I don't know where they all came into play. But it lists the different loan types, and they've added a box called Other Lender, Describe, such as a hard money lender. That was one of those where people would like to say, oh no, I'm paying cash, because they weren't getting a mortgage, but they were getting money from someone else. So there was some other person that controlled the purse strings. So that was always ripe for problems. But if you can do that, you just need to mark it and explain it where the funds are coming from. The section below about how much of the loan, all of this paragraph you need to be talking to your loan officer. It should be in the pre-approval letter they get. It should say the loan type, how much they're putting down, the rate. Most people are just putting the prevailing interest rate at the time, or a lot of people are leaving that blank because it really only survives until application because rates are what they are. I would caution you with the volatility of rates. If your person is close on qualifying at a certain price point, if the interest rate has to be here for them to buy that price, then you might want to put something in the contract, and you've definitely got to stay in close touch with your lender to see how things are changing. And all of that will help you when you're showing property too. If you're pushing something to the limit, like, well, the only way we can do this is if we get the buyer's commission paid and we get $10,000 in closing costs and the rate doesn't go above X, you might need to lower your sales price a little bit because those are a lot of things that have to line up for that sale to work out. But this whole financing paragraph comes from your pre-approval letter, all right? Down at the bottom, I just highlighted they have to make application within 7 days. Your lender usually stays on top of that, but that's just, you need to inform your client. And also to get the pre-approval, they've pretty much applied anyway. But that's just one deadline in here. You as the agent are the keeper of the deadlines, okay? Your client, that's what they're paying you for. You're guiding them through the process. You are the keeper of all the deadlines. So that's the first one. Then it talks about they're going to work diligently to get a loan, get loan approval. In that first big paragraph at the top of the page, it talks about what happens if they don't get loan approval. That is one reason the buyer can legally terminate the contract if they've done everything they're supposed to do, meaning they've been trying. It's not like they just ghosted the lender. Well, then they're in default. They haven't tried to get a loan. But if they've been going through the process, providing everything, and they get turned down, they can terminate the contract, they get their deposit back. And the reason I put terminate then release, I must get this question more than any other from agents all the time. There are two phases to getting out of a contract. If you have a right to terminate, and there's only certain places that that is true in the contract. One is loan approval, one is inspection. I'm trying to remember what HOA. So there are like 3 places that it says if you don't come to terms, you may terminate. So what that means is if you're the buyer, you first send a form that only you sign. You're not having to get any agreement from the seller. You're saying based on paragraph 4, we didn't get the loan, we're terminating. Boom. Or paragraph 16 for home inspection. Then you complete the release, and that's where it says return the deposit to me, the buyer. That's where the battle sometimes comes about, and so that's why it's 2 separate things. The contract's technically dead, but some sellers may not believe you really tried to get your loan, or they may think you're being unreasonable on the home inspection. So sometimes there's a battle over the deposit. But those are the 2 steps. You terminate, then release. Okay, paragraph 5. This is the one for you new folks. This is the only thing you know, but for anybody who's been around, this is where the paragraph changed a little bit. Excuse me. All right, seller concessions. The first one is labeled as closing cost. That was very common 12, 13 years ago when I got into the business. You'd go to buy a house, you had some cash, but you needed some more cash. You had great income, you could qualify for a nice sales price, but you were short on cash. So you would say, all right, Mr. Seller, I'm going to offer you this, but I'm going to offer you $300, but I want $10,000 back in closing. So basically you were offering them $290. That's still the way it works, okay? My note on there that says ask the lender, be close to reality, you need it to be an estimate. You can't just pull a number out the sky. And if you pull out $12,000 or whatever and you think this is, so I'm really only paying $288 for the house, If you can't use up all of that, if your lender doesn't have enough expenses to apply to that, you've just given more money to the seller. So all of that, you're talking to your loan officer through the whole process. So that's the first one. The next one, buyer broker compensation. This is the big change that you've been hearing everybody talk about. It used to be the buyer's commission was kind of set up front when you took a listing. Now that they're totally separate. The listing agreement negotiates what the seller's going to pay the listing agent. And then here in the contract is where you ask for the buyer's agent commission. Think of it just like closing costs, okay? Sometimes when people were making an offer on a house, let's go back to that 300 example, but they wanted 10 in closing. They say, well, I can qualify for 310. It only changes my monthly payment a little bit. I'll offer him 310 and ask for 10 in closing. Mr. Seller's still getting 300, so he's happy. That's what he was asking for, but I'm keeping 10,000 in my pocket to use for renovations on the home or whatever. I'm not putting it all out for closing costs. Think of this buyer broker compensation the same way when you're trying to structure your offer. If that, you're gonna have to, every situation is gonna be different. If it's competitive, you've got to look at this whole document. It all fits together. People always think it's price, and dollars do matter a lot, but I can tell you there's a lot of other things in here that matter a whole lot to people too. How quick you can close, the inspection is a big one, the appraisal, all those things. So the same with commission. You've got to think, am I going in competitive on price? Am I going in competitive on something else? And all of that factors in. But you could perhaps up that sales price to cover your commission. Like if you send it over with 3%, they counter it 2%. That's when you go back to your buyer and say, okay, I charge 3%. Are you going to pay me the difference out of your pocket? Or are we going to up the sales price? Or what are we going to do? So it all becomes a negotiation. That is very foreign to any of us who've been in the business for a while because we were hammered over the head that the commission was not a part of the contract. Now it's right dab in the middle of it. It's actually fine, it's just different. You just gotta get used to it. One note on there that I put, sorry, got cut off a little bit. You cannot get more than what's on your buyer agency. I've seen some deals close and people did get paid more than what was on their buyer agency, so I don't know who's monitoring that, but the way that form is written, it says, my buyer agency says what I charge. So that's why I would write it at 3%. That's what you charge, or whatever it is in the situation. Then when you get into negotiating the contract, if it comes up with something different, you may decide it's worth it to me to help this client, or it's a big enough sales price, I'm willing to cut it to 2.5, or you start doing some of those negotiations. If it comes lower, you just go back and amend your buyer agency, but don't put 2 on your buyer agency telling your seller and then try to ask for 3 in the contract. That's not the way it's supposed to work, okay? So just remember that. That highlighted paragraph, that's what the whole big lawsuit was about. And so they put it in bold. Buyer broker compensation is negotiable, is not fixed, controlled, or suggested by law, MLS, or any realtor association. So that's just summing it up. All right, appraisal. And I'm gonna have to move it along here to stay on track. If the client is getting a loan, there's going to be an appraisal done, all right? If they're paying cash, they may choose not to get an appraisal. Even if they're getting a loan, and even if the bank is going to do the appraisal, there could be situations where you can still mark it's not further subject to the appraisal, which means your client has enough cash that it doesn't matter if that appraisal comes in really low, they're gonna buy the house no matter what the appraisal says. That doesn't happen often, happens some, and sometimes you'll hear people talking about an appraisal gap. There are some clients who can cover part of it. Let's say if it comes up 10,000 short, I've got 10,000 cash, so basically I'm paying 10,000 out of pocket more than what the bank says my house is worth. Before you do any of that, talk to your lender. I cannot stress that enough. When we're in this competitive market, I had one little first-time home buyer, and every deal was different because it depended on what the sales price was, and I was on the phone with Abby every weekend. All right, she needs to go as high as she can. If she goes this high, how much appraisal gap she can cover. Some weekends it was 5,000, some weekends it was 7,500, but all of that, and that's why I was saying at the beginning, it all fits together like a big puzzle. You can't just have a sales price without thinking about the appraisal. And if it's not going to appraise, doesn't matter if you're offering them 50,000 over list, you're just going to have an argument 3 weeks later when the appraisal comes back in. So you want everything to be reasonable and you want to be informed when you're making your offers. And then the other deadline, the appraisal has to be ordered within 15 days of ratification. Your lender stays on top of that, but that's just a reminder for you to check in. Sometimes as a listing agent, you call the other side, hey, has the appraisal been ordered? Nobody's called me yet. So stay on top of those deadlines. This is another one, and I've got it highlighted and circled down below. If the appraisal comes in short, the buyer can first ask the seller to change the price. They can decide to move ahead and they cover the difference, or either side can choose to terminate. Okay? So that's another situation where you do a termination and then a release. Paragraph 7, you just explain that as this is just a warning about wire fraud, and you stress that throughout. Never send money unless you've called and spoken to the attorney. Don't just take an email or a text that says send your money here. Deposit. They give you an option of, or did they finally take it out? Actually, they did take it out. Hallelujah. The cash used to be an option in the contract. We don't take cash deposits. We don't want them. Your lender doesn't want them. They can't verify it, so they can't count it toward the transaction. So no cash. Usually when you're representing the buyer, Hometown Realty is going to be the person holding the deposit, but that's not always the case. If it's new construction, it might be the builder. Some situations, they want the attorney to hold it instead of it coming through to us. Just know who that is. You have an option to mark has paid or will pay. Only mark that has paid if they're giving it to you when they write the contract, okay? And then you immediately turn it in to your agent services coordinator. If they're going to send it, because nobody uses a checkbook anymore, if they're going to use deposit link or if they're going to drop a check by the office, you would mark the will pay. Actually, do they have, oh, they have deposit link on here as an option now. That's another thing I should have highlighted. But if it's will pay, you put when it's going to come in. Normal is 2 to 5 days. Everybody kind of takes that for granted, but that is another contingency. If that person doesn't send that deposit in, they're in default. So you, the agent, are staying on top of the buyer. Hey, we've got to have this in by Friday. Make sure you get it there. All right? Let's flip to page 3. Settlement. That's when you have closing. The buyer gets to say where they want their closing. In Virginia, it's separate. The seller has its representation. The buyer has their representation, so they can choose. We suggest that you recommend MG Law, our affiliate. A typical closing is 30 to 45 days. Again, talk to your lender. Depending on your client's situation, if they're waiting on something to happen in their approval process, depending on the type of loan. What are some other circumstances? I guess those are probably the main ones of why it would take longer. If they're getting grants or something like that, you need to know the timing. So again, before you go out on a weekend, check in with your loan officer, Hey, if they're looking at this property and I think it's going to be USDA, what are we looking at there? 45. Yeah. So typically 30 to 45, but again, in that competitive situation, you may want to close quickly, so you need to find out how quickly it can be done. And sometimes town is great about closing in less than 30, especially if it's somebody maybe who's kind of been through the process. Maybe they they've been through it multiple times and their offer hasn't gotten accepted, so everything's like done, they're just waiting. But again, you can't assume that. You need to talk to your loan officer. So that's that first box. It's the more general option. It says we're going to close on this date or a reasonable time thereafter, as long as everyone's making diligent effort. All those are gray terms. But most people prefer that because it does give you a little wiggle room. The second box, sellers might prefer because it has a drop dead date in it. It says we're going to close on this date, or if we haven't closed within 10 days of that date, the seller can choose, or the party that's willing and able, because sometimes the seller's not ready, the party who's willing and able could choose to terminate the agreement. So some people like that. They don't have to. If everybody's happy and it's just some little hiccup we've run into, it can close 12 days later, 15, whatever. But some sellers like that option because it doesn't have them just hanging out there waiting for a buyer to get their loan approved. All right. Possession takes place after settlement. That seems obvious, but you'd be surprised of some of the war stories we've heard over the years. People just breaking into a house thinking it's theirs after they've written a contract. And yes, that did happen. That paragraph that I circled, that was one of the new ones, is the reason I circled it. And basically, it was no new information. It just kind of specified what items the seller is going to provide to the purchaser at settlement that come through the title search. It just kind of spelled out some of those. Paragraph 10, occupancy. Are they going to live in the house or not? That matters to your lender. That's why that's in there. There's different types of loan programs. There's different types of pre-qualification, pre-approval. So you need to ask them. But all you do, you're not the judge and jury. You ask the question, are you going to occupy the house or not? And hopefully they'll give you a yes or no answer and not a well. 11, residential property disclosure. This is another one of those things that because it's so routine, people don't take it seriously. It is a required disclosure by the state of Virginia. It's two parts to it. What this is referring to is the actual disclosure, which is the one-page form when you go into your documents. And I think it says residential property disclosure or seller affidavit or something like that. It just has signatures. It refers you to a bunch of codes of law. And basically what it's saying is, to the best of the seller's knowledge, there's nothing materially wrong with the home making it unsafe or uninhabitable. It's very broad, okay? And the second part to this disclosure, what backs it up, is that 3-page summary of rights. Those are all the things the seller does not have to disclose, but sometimes buyers think maybe they should. So when you're working with the buyer, I would give them that form too. When I started, about the only thing we talked about was the Megan's law, the sex offender law. That was the big thing that form covered. Now it's 3 pages, and it's Chesapeake Bay, and it's covenants, not HOA, but like recorded covenants. Flood insurance is 3 pages of items that says, Mr. Buyer, if these are deal breakers for you, you need to check these out before you make your offer, because these are not reasons to get out of the contract. If you get an answer in the process that you don't like, then that's too bad. You were supposed to check it out beforehand, okay? What is the problem? People take the form for granted because it's just out there, and on 99% of the listings, the listing agent has attached it out there and the seller signed it, and they just keep on rolling. It is a disclosure from seller to buyer, so never have your client fill out a blank one. I've seen agents do that. They'll just have their client sign a blank one, send it over with the offer. Well, you don't know if they had anything to disclose or not. You need that form to come from the seller. It's also very important, and none of this is in the contract. You get this by reading the law that supports this paragraph. If the seller, let's say you just forget and you never give them that property disclosure, and your deal is smooth and easy, right up at closing something happens, a buyer can legally walk from the contract right up to closing if they have not been given that disclosure. So it's very, very important, even though most of the time nothing comes out of it. Okay, so just make sure you get that and you don't have your clients sign a blank one. 12, that's just a fair housing disclosure. 13 and 14, we used to have separate paragraphs describing single family and condos. Now it's all treated as one. The state kind of unified or made uniform the packages. They're called common interest communities. So that's anything that has an HOA. They have a uniform package that they will receive. It's called the resale certificate. It's provided by the seller. The other big change that's happened in recent years, the seller may have to pay for it up front. It used to be we agents would order them, as a service and get it all delivered, and then the bill would just be paid at closing. That doesn't happen very often now. It usually has to be paid for up front. So just, if you're a listing agent, prepare your seller. Your job as the buyer's agent, it's going to come to you. The agent's going to send it to you. That 3-day right of rescission, because that's what all this is about, which means, I probably should have explained that first. Buyers in Virginia have 3 days from the date of receipt of their HOA package to get out of the deal. That is another place that they can terminate the deal. Technically, the way it's meant to be interpreted, they've seen something in that HOA that they don't agree with. In reality, it's a get out of jail free card. If you're putting a property under contract in an HOA community, you always know you have an out. Don't push that to your client, but I'm just telling you, when you're negotiating, if you've hit a roadblock and seller is not giving and they don't want to let you out of the contract for maybe home inspection, you can just say, well, Mr. Seller, we'll see what happens when the HOA package comes. They want out of the contract. You're not meeting our terms here. You know, so just keep that in mind as part of your negotiating. It's always a way that the buyer can get out. But that 3-day clock starts the second that package hits your email. So let's say you get it from the listing agent at 4 o'clock on a Friday and you've already taken off and you don't check your email till Monday morning. That's a problem. Their 3 days is just about over. So again, check your deadlines. You're the keeper of the deadlines. Get that forwarded to your buyer as soon as possible and confirm that they got it. It's not just that you can shoot it over. Yes, sir?
Is that supposed to be ordered to the agent, the buying agent, or is that supposed to be ordered to the seller or the actual buyer?
The seller orders it and it comes to them or their listing agent. And usually the listing agent sends it to the buyer's agent.
Okay, and then so when the buyer's agent gets it,
that's when the clock starts. It's when the buyer's agent gets it. So that's why when it hits your email, you've got to forward it as soon as possible. Okay? Now,
Just a note on the selling side. I recently had one ordered for one of my clients. These aren't always cheap.
oh, they're very expensive.
$350.
Oh, that's,
My client paid like
there's been, they can be $500 or $600.
This isn't a $25 or $50 item usually. It's pretty expensive. So on the selling side, you may want to advise your client, if they have to provide it, advise your client that this is a fairly significant expense for the documentation you
Yep.
receive.
Yep.
A lot of people think it's just like the big binder to it, and like they think they can just like hand them their own one to it, and that you have to order.
Yeah.
Like,
No.
with your name on it.
Amara.
I'll also say, as TC, I've learning a lot in the last 2 months, but if you have a townhome that's associated with the neighborhood, you're gonna have 2.
Sometimes there's 2.
Yeah.
Yep.
So that's
Yep.
an additional expense to the expense that you've already told us.
Right. So as a listing agent, you get all that information from your seller up front. And when you're signing that listing agreement, that's the good time to get who's the HOA, who's the contact, and maybe get that process started. Some sellers will say, oh, I'll just go ahead and do it now. In today's market, that's probably okay, but they do have a shelf life. I can't quote you exactly what the shelf life is. So if you've got a property that you think might sit a while, you really need to wait till you go under contract.
Don't some of them require the buyer name?
Yeah, that's true.
Some do, yes.
If you get through HomeWise, like you get, a lot of these are through the website HomeWise now, and it's pretty easy. When you go on there, you ask them about giving it to the other agent. They do ask for the other agent or the seller's email to put in there, and then it does get sent to them automatically, which is nice. So then you don't have to worry about like sending it back to them right away. It gets sent there automatically, and then you have like the actual thing on HomeWise letting you know the date that they received it as well.
Now the note I made at the top of the page, this goes back to when things were super, super crazy a year or 2 ago. They did change the law in 2023 to make a buyer's offer more competitive. They now legally can waive their 3-day right to rescind. So if somebody really wants a house, and that's just one more thing they can take off the contingency list, is I don't care what the HOA package says, we're moving forward. All right. The next paragraph, Owners Association repairs. When that package comes back, there's a page in the back and I forget what, I guess it's just called violations. But so the way this works, the HOA has people that go out and check a property when they're doing these, getting these packages together. Some communities have really specific little like I sold a house at King's Charter one time, and the violation was the pineapple wasn't on the mailbox. You know, that was one of the violations. But it can be something major. It can be the shed was never approved or whatever. And a lot of times it's just that the documentation isn't there. It doesn't always blow up into a big problem. But I learned this as a new agent. I got lucky. I didn't know, all I knew was when I get this package, I've got to send it to my buyer. I didn't look at it. I just sent it to them. Found out a week or so before closing there were some violations. And per the contract, if you want the seller to fix them, it has to be in writing and done within 5 days. Luckily for me, it was just like painting a mailbox, and I thought, well, I can go paint a mailbox if the buyer really wants it done. But I learned my lesson that you need to look at that before you send it. You don't have to read the whole package, but you need to go to that summary page that talks about, are there any violations? And if there are, bring those to your client's attention and say, is this something you want the seller to address? If so, we've got to put an addendum in writing within 5 days. If you miss that 5-day window, too bad, the problem is now your buyers.
Within 5 days of what?
When you get the HOA package.
Also, be careful on the buyer side too, because I had one recently in Spring West where, like 90 days after we'd already closed and stuff, I was on the buyer side, and my buyer called me and said that the person before had installed a storm door, which are allowed in the neighborhood. You have to get permission from the HOA to install the storm door, and the previous seller didn't get permission to get installed a storm door, so she had to pay the HOA fine and stuff like that, even though she wasn't even letting me install the storm door. And looking back on it, I should have probably looked through the HOA packet and seen that and made sure that they had like approval for the storm door.
And because sometimes it's just a form, and you will find, sometimes it gets missed on one transaction, it's because nobody had a problem. So this is like transaction 3, my last seller I represented, they were asked to suddenly provide documentation for stuff that was put in the house before they bought it 15 years ago. But yeah, so just stay on top of that. All right, I am not going to talk much about home inspection, only because we could talk a long time about home inspection, and we do separate classes on that. What I want to point out to you is kind of just general ideas of what these paragraphs say and an overview about home inspection. Educate your buyer, set the right expectations. They're shopping for a used house. Anything they're going to ask the seller to address has to be a true defect. It can't just be something that's old but it's still working, and it can't be just something cosmetic like the carpet's in really bad shape. So get those expectations up front. We said inspection is one of the places you can get, because buyers always say, well, when can I get out? How can I get out of the contract? This is one of those places, but you don't want that. You don't want to keep writing offers over and over. Kevin does a really good class on working with buyers and setting those inspections up front and saying, you are buying this house, and anything we find can be fixed, or you can get a credit. There's ways to handle it. So don't let your clients put a contract on a house that is not suited for them. I had one couple had no money, but they were so desperate in that competitive 2022 market that they were like, well, we're going to buy this house. I said, well, what are you going to do? You've just gone through and named 100 things that have to be done. You don't have the money to fix that. This is not the house for you. So when you're showing houses, before you ever write a contract, and Kevin did that one probably got recorded, I think, didn't it? About knowing what to look for yourself so that you can point it out. This is going to cost you this in 2 years or whatever. Be your client's advocate and set the right expectation going into the home inspection. You as the buyer's agent, that middle paragraph there. There are 3 things you're going to provide to the seller. You're going to provide the actual inspection report, an estimated cost to repair, and the formal repair request. Those 2 kind of go hand in hand. So you're going to send over an addendum that says we want you to fix these 3 things, and this is our estimate of what each of those is going to cost. So it's 3 things you have to provide, and that has to be done within your inspection period. Normal is kind of 10 to 15 days. A lot of times in competitive situations you see 7. If you're going to do 7, you better have your inspector on speed dial and make sure they can get out there. I also recommend you do your inspection early. Don't wait till day 14 to get somebody out there. because the general home inspection may show up and say, well, there's something going on with the roof, there's something going on with the crawl space, and they don't want to give you an estimate. I would try to find a different home inspector because they should be able to give you some kind of estimate. But you may need to have other contractors come out and evaluate things. So plan early, start it early in the process. Also, you can't ask the seller to do an inspection. You can't send over a repair request that says, there's something wrong with the HVAC. Seller, check it out and fix it. That doesn't cut it. That's where you've got to have the HVAC guy out there to tell you this is what's wrong and this is what needs to be fixed. All right, I think I covered all of that. Once you've sent that over, that starts your second clock ticking. It's called the negotiation period. That's in that paragraph at the top of the page. It's a 7-day period. So you send over your request for either repair or credit. Seller counters. Y'all have 7 days together to come to terms. So it doesn't mean that the seller has 7 days to get back to you. You have to be in agreement at the end of that 7 days. Sometimes people play the waiting game. They send it back day 6 or whatever. But you should be talking to the other agent through that whole 7-day period and seeing where you are and trying to come to terms. If at the end of the 7 days, buyer and seller have not agreed on terms, then the purchaser can either accept the seller's last offer, like he was going to do 3 of the 5 things, and yeah, I really want the house, so I'm going to move ahead, or they can terminate the contract. All right. That little box there that's called an optional paragraph, that was a new addition a couple years ago. Instead of being a true as is, where you use the as is addendum, sometimes people use this. Maybe they've written it to say we're going to do an informational only home inspection, but I still want to have my out. So I'm going to reserve the right to terminate because I guess an as is has that in there as well. But sellers don't usually like this. I mean, if you're going to try to make your inspection competitive, checking yes to this box does not help you be competitive because it does give you an out if you're not satisfied.
Cindy, is there a lot of home inspections now?
Seeing more than we were. It's also very area specific. If you're in a super hot area like over near U of R, people are still going 100 over, no inspection, no appraisal, no nothing. You got a house that needs some work, you're probably going to see a home inspection. Okay?
Like, in competitive situations, like, you still see, like, you can get an inspection but waive your right to pull out of the, contract for the inspection, which will look a lot better for the seller, but also, like, just get people's heads and, like, a lot of people would rather do that.
Right, but that's where you would not check that optional box. All right, default. I always breeze past this paragraph. I said this just says what happens if either side does not hold up to their end of the bargain. Just to let you know, you could be responsible for all the brokerage fees, you'll be responsible for legal fees, and I said, but we're not going to let that happen. So just kind of move on. 18 just restates, it just has the law there that says the buyer gets to choose their own settlement agent. Okay. 19, broker compensation. I highlighted the part at the bottom because it's new. So when they changed this, that we were going to ask for the buyer broker compensation in the contract. Legally, I guess they have to then, so you as the agent are not a party to this contract between buyer and seller. But it's saying for purposes of the commission, the buyer broker becomes a third-party beneficiary. So if something goes awry and seller does not pay your commission, you have the right to get it enforced. Now, of course, anytime anything goes to a lawsuit, it's costly and expensive, and you'll have to decide if it's worth it. But that was just a legal thing they did to say, because technically you're not a party of the contract, but you are made a third-party beneficiary related to commission only. All right, the home warranty paragraph. That was another thing that kind of went away. People weren't, when I started, the normal things were ask for at least $5,000 in closing costs, ask for the seller to pay for a $500 home warranty. Those were just kind of standard things. Those all went away in recent years. From our perspective as agents, we want you to be protected and make sure that you make your buyer aware they can purchase a home warranty. Now in this market, sellers still may not be willing to pay for it, but the buyer can buy it, and the buyer can buy it at any time. The way I know as a broker that you discuss that with them, technically the way I know, is if a box is marked. If I get a contract and it's totally blank, you're going to get a note from me that says, get them to sign the warranty application and they can waive it. I don't care if they get a warranty or not, but I need documentation that you told them they could get a warranty. Because it happens. You skip over that paragraph, you're moving fast. A month after they move in, something like an HVAC breaks, and suddenly they're like, well, you didn't tell me that I could get a warranty on my 15-year-old heat pump. You know, you didn't let me know that it was available. So just make sure you mark a box. You don't have to do the hard sell. Just let them, show them the brochure, let them know it's available. They can choose if they want it or not. All right, 22, the purchaser's disclosure. They are warranting, again, in the contract that it's not contingent. They don't have to sell anything in order to buy this house. If that is the case, your lender letter should say it's contingent on the sale of the home, and all of that would be disclosed up in other terms. But this is, if you don't add anything, the assumption is they don't have to sell anything in order to move forward. Paragraph 23 is where you add all those other terms. And sometimes it's weird things. You know, it can be very specific to the property. Like, we want the tires behind the garage moved away before closing. Sometimes it's not a super legal thing or technical thing. It's just something that's going to be happen. Sometimes what people do, instead of doing a home inspection, let's say you're walking through, but you see one or two things that you would like the seller to take care of. Maybe you write those in here. Seller to repair XYZ. So it's kind of negotiated right up front with your offer, and then maybe you don't do an in-depth inspection. So note that my examples here, we do another whole class, and if you go on Hometown University, it may be recorded on clauses and special situations. When you're reading this contract, you're going to notice that it's written if then. If this happens, then this happens. That's the way all your clauses should be written. Don't just put informational home inspection, okay? A lot of people kind of assume that means you're going to do it and not ask for anything. But if you don't spell that out and then you find out you still want the house, but man, there's more work than you expected, you got a big battle, because sellers saying, well, you didn't say you were going to ask for anything. You just said informational only. So there's a whole bunch of clauses that we've put out there, and always do it as an if then. If this happens or if this doesn't happen, then this is the consequence. So my examples here are very abbreviated, just kind of giving you some ideas of what might happen if the sale is contingent on the settlement. So maybe they don't have to sell their house, maybe it's under contract. So you would write, it's contingent on this house closing, and you would give the address and when it's closing and all of that. Something like the seller's going to professionally clean the home. Sorry, I've got a typo there. If agents related to the client, that's where you would put that. That's something that needs to be disclosed. All right, 24 is a bunch, I just tell people standard provisions, it's legal jargon. Some things in here we're just going to kind of breeze through with a brief summary. If they start picking this apart, that's when you tell them to go talk to their lawyer. The first one, though, expense prorations. Make sure your buyer knows that things like taxes and propane or heating oil are prorated. And that could be a big number. Let's say when they buy the house, close on the house, the tank's just been filled. That could be $500, $600, $700, $800 that the buyer's got to come up with. We've gotten calls from little buyer agents on the other side. Well, she doesn't want that, and she doesn't have the $800. Well, too bad, buddy. The contract says it transfers, that if the seller chooses to prorate it. That is one of those that when I mentioned at the beginning, if you're getting another contract from another area, sometimes it's different. Sometimes it's the other person, that and yeah, they either say it, they either make you choose or it's spelled out in the contract. But for us, taxes and fuel are prorated. All right, title. It says they're going to give you a clear, seller's going to provide a clear title. The part at the bottom that I circled, if they run into a title issue and it is something that can be resolved within 30 days, because sometimes it's something administrative, maybe a second mortgage didn't get removed, or I'm trying to think what else it could be. But sometimes it's minor things, it's just paperwork things, something wasn't filed properly. If it can be resolved, both parties in this contract are agreeing to give the seller 30 days to fix it. So it's not like buyer can say, oops, I'm done. If it goes past the 30 days, then that's when you start having the discussions. Maybe we're going to terminate this because it's a bigger problem and it can't be resolved. Paragraph C, this just talks about rollback taxes. Oh, this is the one I was thinking of. In the Northern Virginia contract, I think it says the opposite. Here, the seller pays any rollback taxes. A rollback tax is if a property is being taxed at one rate, maybe it's farmland, and now it's going to be taxed at a higher rate. There's make-up taxes, and the seller has to pay those. Risk of loss, that's talking about home insurance. And the property is the responsibility of the sellers right up until closing. So if something breaks, if something happens, if you have a tree fall in the yard, that's the responsibility of the seller right up until closing. Along with that, equipment condition and inspection. Everything has to be the way it was at the time you wrote the contract. And it says you're going to deliver the house in broom clean condition and exercise reasonable and ordinary care. So like in the summer months, the seller should cut the grass. As the buyer's agent, you may get calls all the time, hey, they didn't cut the grass. I've sent people over to cut grass just to get it done so my client would be happy. But technically that's responsibility of the seller. That paragraph also authorizes your final walkthrough. So you've done your home inspection, you've sent over there was repairs that they were going to do. You want to go in and check and make sure those repairs were done, and you also want to get paid receipts for those. So that's the paragraph that allows you to do that final walkthrough. All right, paragraphs F, G, and H work together. F is well and septic, and so you just mark which type of system they have, whether it's a well or public water, a septic or public sewer. And then it talks about if it's a well and if it's a septic, they have to provide, the seller pays for the inspections of those. That's different in some other contracts as well. The seller has to pay for those inspections, and it has to be done within 30 days of closing, so they can't pull out something that's really old. Like everything in this contract, it's negotiable. Sometimes if you're trying to make your offer competitive, maybe the buyer agrees to go ahead and pay for it. You would just mark it up accordingly. But as written, the seller is responsible for those inspections. The part where I put negotiable, those are the different kinds of things you could inspect related to a septic. Of course, the seller's going to want the least, the buyer's going to want the most. So you would just check the boxes that apply. Termite, same thing. They're going to provide a termite report. And the reason they work together, when you go to paragraph H has a dollar limit in it. If you leave it blank, the default is 1,000. So what that means, if they find a well, septic, or termite problem with, say maybe they just need a termite treatment, $500. Seller is responsible for paying for that treatment. It's no discussions, nothing happens. If you filled in the amount, then they're responsible for up to that amount. I would say if you're writing a contract on an old house with an old septic, you might try to ask for more. They may not agree to it, but you might say, there's a good chance we're going to have a problem, so we want the seller to be responsible for $3,500 or $5,000. Now, that affects the appeal of your offer, so you got to look at the whole picture and see how that factors in. But if you know that, if they'll accept it, that's one battle you've gotten taken care of up front and not when the septic inspection is done. So just keep that in mind. But the default there is 1,000. All right, paragraph I, VA and FHA loans, they just restate one more time for those loans, the house must appraise for the sales price. Paragraph J, mechanics lien disclosure, that ties into those repairs and getting the paid receipts. Anywhere in the United States, if somebody does work and they don't get paid for it, they can put a lien on the house. So if they're doing repairs as part of the home inspection, you want to make sure you've got paid receipts showing that they were paid, or have the receipt paid at the closing table, have the bill paid at the closing table. That way there's no chance of those things showing up later. And also part of the title search will show if there's any liens on the property. K, non-binding mediation. If we get into a problem with this agreement before we get to the closing table, we agree to go to mediation before filing lawsuits. It is still a legal process and it still costs money, but it's just a different legal process. Paragraph L, miscellaneous. The big thing here, anything that is agreed upon between buyer and seller needs to be in writing. This is the entire, this plus any addendums are the document. Do not let the listing agent say, oh yeah, they're gonna leave that, or yeah, they're gonna fix that. If it matters, get it in writing, because the verbal is worth nothing. The seller is representing that all parties who should sign have signed. Going to the last page. Acceptance. There's a definition here of ratification and delivery. This is not fully ratified until all people have signed it and the final copy has made it back to the other party, so they both have final copies. So you're getting these last couple initials on a deal on a Friday night and you forget to send it back to the other side. Technically, it's not ratified because they don't have the final copy back yet. A lot of these things that I've mentioned, if everybody wants the deal to work, the deal's gonna work. I see deals closing all the time where things aren't initialed, things aren't signed off, but everybody wanted the deal to work and it works. But if you make a mistake like that and somebody wants out of the deal, it opens the door to let them get out of the deal. So make sure you get it back, and that same thing applies to the paragraph above it. The ratification date. When you submit your offer, you're saying if we don't hear back from you by this date, the contract is dead. And a lot of agents, I've seen a bunch in my office, nobody puts a date there. But most people do, especially when it's a competitive situation and you want to know what's going on. If that changes, let's say you go back and forth, maybe you put on there that they have to get back to you by the 1st, you all don't get, and you sign it on the 28th, you don't get it worked out until the 2nd or 3rd, go back and update that date. This date should be equal to or greater than the last initial date, okay? And I will tell you, I got burned on that. I was working with people I knew. I was selling my house off market, and I kept asking, where are those final initials? Where are those final initials? And they kind of went silent, and then the next day, yeah, we're not going to move forward. So, like I said, if somebody wants to get an out, something like that is a way they can get out of a contract. Okay?
Was that something you forgot to get?
Oh, no. They just were slow getting it back to me. They had said, we're done, and I was like, okay, great. Send me those last 2 initials. So we weren't technically, but it was just on that. It was on the acceptance date. It wasn't on any of the terms. And then he said, well, you know, we're technically not ratified. And I'm like, yeah, that's why I asked you 3 times for it. You know? So, and it was no big deal. I mean, it didn't harm me in any way. It just irritated me. But
Cindy, when you're amending terms
mm-hmm.
on the initials, is it just the purchaser and seller that have to initial, or the agents as well?
Just the two.
Because I had a transaction recently that I just had the seller and the agent wanted my initials on it as well. And
Was it in the
I
Northern
thought
Neck?
But I didn't think it was necessary.
Was it in the Northern Neck?
No.
No? Because a lot of, you will find different pockets do things differently. They have a certain way they want it done. Another thing to watch out for, some people send it back and the client has initialed every single page. So that's one of those ways. I don't know if they're using it as a tactic and they can say, oh, well, you didn't initial every page at the bottom, so we're not fully ratified. So just watch out for those kind of things. But technically, it's just the 2 parties to the contract.
Okay.
Guys, it is 1:59. I feel like I have talked so fast and thrown so much at you. This will be put out there on Hometown University. Older versions are out there as well, but of course the contract has changed since then. So this is dealing with the most current one. Like I said, the best thing you can do if you're new, read it, practice filling it out, get your questions answered. Also, get somebody to review it before you even put it in front of your buyer, okay? You don't want to have to be, oops, oops, oops. You want to make a professional impression on your clients. any of your managers are available. If you're on a team, you've got team leaders that are available. So that's all I got. All right. Thank you.